Spring is in the air at Global Voice Broadcasting. Fresh new shows are hitting the airwaves every day. Shows about all the things that matter to you in your life. Music, fashion, celebs, and more. It's all here, and it's getting better every day. Only at Global Voice Broadcasting.
I highly recommend Ms. Hicks. Her books, her CDs are encouraging.
I bought her book, A Hill to Climb. She's a very inspirational speaker.
And I look forward to one day being able to work with her.
Your power lies within you. Let it loose.
Aspiration, inspiration, motivation, edification, determination. These are the keys of life success brought to you by none other than award-winning author, motivational lecturer, business consultant, and much more as she gets you aimed to your purpose. And now, ladies and gentlemen, young and elder, from Hollywood to the entire world, here is your host of Aim to Purpose, the radio show, Louise Hicks, along with her co-host, yours truly, Kenan Wesley Mason.
Hello, world. How is everybody today? We thank you all once again for joining us, and I am Louise Hicks, your host of Aim to Purpose, the radio show.
And I am Kenan Mason, and I want to welcome everyone from all around the world to Aim to Purpose, the radio show. Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be, as we bring you global voice broadcasting, Aim to Purpose, the radio show, as we have part two of our last week's conversation about mental illness, or dispelling the myths of mental illness.
Yes, and we are so excited to continue our conversation today with Dr. Jeffrey Schaler, who has Skyped in with us today. And thank you so much, Dr. Schaler, for Skyping in. We're not going to have any sports therapy today or our community news and commentary by Robert Snell and Shamika Brown, because we really wanted to get into this. And as you know, last month was National Mental Health Awareness Month, and we talked with you about launching our Go Mental campaign and all about my personal interest in this, because I have an adult son now who has been diagnosed and labeled as mentally ill with a paranoid schizophrenic diagnosis after being diagnosed with cancer at the age of 14. Now he's 34. And so
and before we go any further, let's make this formal. He's a psychologist, a PhD, taught thousands of undergraduate and graduate students at American University in Washington, D.C., and Johns Hopkins University. His book, Addiction is a Choice, was featured on ABC News 2020. As we welcome, once again, a warm welcome to Dr. Jeffrey A. Schaler.
Thank you very
Hello,
much.
Dr. Schaler, and thank you again for joining us for part two of this program today on the myth of mental illness.
It's very kind to be back on your show. You're wonderful hosts, and you're really tackling such an important issue. I was wondering if I could start by talking about a famous study that many people don't know about, but I guarantee it will blow your mind.
Absolutely.
That's great. Let us give the number out first for anyone.
Yes.
Because we are live, and feel free to call in if you have any questions for Dr. Schaler. The number is 323-522-5482. Once again, 323-522-5482.
Yes, and that's from anywhere around the world. Call in. This is a very important subject matter that we're discussing right now. We want to hear all questions and comments from anywhere around the world. 1-323-522-5482. Go ahead and continue, Dr. Schaler.
Thank you very much. Well, addiction is considered a type of mental illness. And so I want to just briefly describe a very famous study that many people don't know about. Now, when we talk about being addicted to a drug like heroin, most people believe, as we've been taught by addiction treatment providers and by the government, that the drug heroin has the power, so to speak. In other words, the drug controls your behavior and you can't use your will to control your consumption of the drug. Now, in 1973, a very important study was published. It was conducted and published in the Archives of General Psychiatry, and it was conducted by a group of epidemiologists. Those are people that track the occurrences of particular diseases. And these were soldiers in Vietnam that were being brought home. And the Veterans Administration was concerned because so many soldiers had been using heroin in Vietnam, and they wanted to provide enough treatment facilities for these people once they got home. So, as most people have been taught, you can't just quit using heroin by making a decision to stop using. The pleasure that comes from using heroin is said to be so strong that no matter what, you will continue to use the drug. But this is what is different about this study. It shocked people, particularly in the United States. In other countries, like in Canada and in the United Kingdom, they were not as surprised because they've been dealing with these findings for some time. But what happened was this was the largest study of confirmed heroin addicts ever studied. And there were about 400 people who had been using heroin, and they were confirmed as heroin users through urinalysis. In other words, they knew they had been using it. And in Vietnam, heroin was very cheap and it was very pure. It's very strong.
Oh, yeah.
And so when they came back home, the Veterans Administration wanted to be prepared to help people who had been, quote, hooked on heroin. And so they did all these urinalysis and wanted to find out how many people were hooked on it. And when they came home, 87% of the 400 people quit using heroin like that. There was no treatment. There was no intervention. They just quit. Now, the researchers who were following them had their minds blown. They said, wait a minute, what's going on here? You're not supposed to just stop when you come home. And in other words, by just changing your environment, that shouldn't be enough for you to stop. They interviewed all of these, quote, heroin addicts, and they said, why is it that you quit? Is it because you couldn't get heroin once you came home? And the users said, no, we could get heroin if we wanted to. The bottom line was that we did not need to use heroin to cope with our experience of being at home. When we were in Vietnam, it was such a miserable experience that we kept using heroin as a way to numb ourselves to the experience of being there. But once we came home, we didn't need to do that. And the thing that was really shocking was the researchers said, well, didn't you experience really intense withdrawal? I mean, withdrawal is supposed to drive you to continue using the drugs. And they said, no, that really wasn't an issue. We could get more heroin if we wanted to. The bottom line was we didn't need to use heroin because we used heroin in Vietnam just to avoid the experience of misery being there. Once we came home, we stopped.
Right.
And whether they had withdrawal, and not all of them did have withdrawal, Or if they did have withdrawal, it was not so strong as for them to continue using. In other words, do they need to break the law to continue using? No. Why is it that they stopped using heroin? Well, they stopped using it because they did not need to use it to cope with the experience of being at home. And you see, that's an environmental issue. It's not the issue of the drug, because what we have been taught is that if you use the drug, you can't stop.
Right.
Now, many people said, oh, well, these people who were using the drug weren't really addicted. That's why they could stop. And the researchers, who were just as shocked as anybody else, said, well, the thing is that they had been using heroin for at least 6 months. Bottom line is that if you've been using it for 6 months, that's not enough for you to get addicted. In other words, you could stop even after using it for 6 months. There's something else that's going on. And this is the thing that we must pay attention to if people want to help people who are using heroin. And that is what's going on in their environment that they choose to use the drug to avoid what they're experiencing.
Yes.
Now, that's a big problem. How can you figure that out? Well, we know that the people who use drugs constitute what we call a heterogeneous population. In other words, fancy sounding word for basically something simple. People use drugs for different reasons, in different ways, with different results. And there is no one type of heroin user. People are different, and the results of their use is different. And it's very hard to figure out what kind of environment is most conducive to people who are inclined to use the drugs. It's not just, now, the thing is that our drug policies today are based on the idea that drug users constitute what we call a homogeneous population. In other words, all drug users are the same. They use for the same reasons, and they've got to go through the same kind of treatment. But that's not true.
Right.
We know that people use for different reasons. And that's very difficult to figure out because the environments that they go through are different. And sometimes poverty is an issue. Sometimes racism is an issue. But I think it's a very big mistake to attribute use to just racism and poverty, because there are plenty of wealthy white people who are really using drugs in a very self-destructive manner. It's convenient for a lot of white people to say, well, they're using drugs because they're black and they're poor.
Right.
Wrong. The white people are buying the drugs from people who are poor and black and minorities because the white people want to use the drugs to avoid some kind of experience that they're having. And it doesn't seem to have much to do with poverty or whatever else, being a minority. There's something else, I think, that has to do with finding meaning in their lives. They're not experiencing much joy or contentment in their lives, and money does not have a whole lot to do with it.
And I'm glad you brought that out.
Are you with me on this?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And I'm glad you brought that out, Dr.
Hello?
Schaler. Yes, I'm with you. I hear you.
I can't hear you. Did I lose you?
No, we're here. We're here. We hear you.
Can you hear us?
I can't hear anybody.
We hear you. Can you hear us now? Hello?
Are you there?
Yeah, we're having a little technical difficulty,
Oh, gosh,
I guess.
I've lost
But just
you.
hold on.
Oh,
You
geez.
haven't lost. Don't hang up.
Hold
Let me
on.
see if I can get
Don't
back
hang
on.
up. You haven't lost us. Hold on. Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah,
No,
here.
you hadn't lost us. We heard everything you said. And,
Okay, great.
We were having
Well,
a little
my
bit of a
point here is
technical
this.
difficulty there, but I
Okay.
heard what you said, and
Okay.
I'm glad you brought that out because, like you said, it's not everybody is unique, And the heroin study that you brought out, that was a very interesting study because it's about a coping mechanism, and each one of us, our chemical makeup is different. And like myself, I can use myself as an example. I've never used any type of street drugs. I've never even smoked marijuana. I don't even know what it's like no more than smelling it from someone else, because that was my decision not to. Because of my upbringing, a lot of it I was told not to get involved in it once we found out about what it was. And I, growing up in Shreveport, Louisiana, I didn't even know what marijuana was until I was 18 years old. That's how little we knew about what was going on with that. And the environment, as you mentioned, has a lot to do with it. And I'm glad you brought out about the racism part of it and the poverty part of it, because that is an interesting component of how we are stigmatized as Black people about drugs, that we are the ones that are taking all these drugs, and of course we don't bring the drugs into the country, and of course there's a war on drugs, but I don't believe there's a war on drugs, because just like you can eradicate everybody else. We went and got Bin Laden, so they said. So why can't we eradicate drugs if we wanted to? But there's a bigger picture of these drugs coming into this country, and there is no war on drugs as far as I'm concerned, and that's my perspective of it. So
I agree with you. There's a war on people, but there's not a war on drugs.
Right.
And frankly, I've been influenced by Malcolm X's views on drugs. And one thing that I suspect he would not have agreed with at all is that people were enslaved to drug addiction, because he proved to himself and to others that he had the power to change his behavior. He didn't buy the whole idea that, oh, you're so helpless you can't get out of using drugs. No, he proved that he could change his behavior based on his environmental experience. I don't think he would have bought the idea that it was a disease at all. Now, the other thing, though, is that if we apply this same idea to what we call mental illness, there is no one type of person who is suffering with mental illness. It means different things to different people. And we can't just treat them all as if they're the same. There are no two people who are identical. They have different reasons for suffering, and they cope with those reasons in different ways. That's why I personally have a difficult time generalizing about people who are, quote, mentally ill. It means different things to them, and we can't just group them all together as if they're all the same.
That's right.
We have to find out what it is that's going on in each person's life. And a lot of people don't like to look at it from that point of view, because it's expensive. You have to figure out what's going on, right? So it's easier to say they're all the same, and let's just treat them all the same way. But that's kind of a cop-out, because people aren't all the same. Every person is different. Right?
That is right. So, it's for example, I believe that things like autism, you have an illness or, quote, a disease like autism, which I believe can be classified as a mental illness or an illness of the mind via the vaccinations and everything that's been found to be the primary culprit of autism versus something like social anxiety disorder, which which is the, quote, disease of shyness.
Exactly. That's a very good point. You know, you think about the pharmaceutical investments in these different ideas. They have an investment in creating conditions that their drugs will treat.
That's right.
And I don't think we should overlook that. You know, they say, well, do you have trouble with shyness and speaking in public? Well, then you may have what you said, social anxiety disorder, and you can take this drug and it'll make you feel better.
That's right.
The bottom line is that most people have trouble speaking in public.
Yes.
It's one of the most common anxieties there is.
That's right. It's a part of human emotion for many people. But it's an emotional state of being. If you're timid or shy, or some people have fear of speaking in public or whatnot, that's not an illness. That's something that can be subsided by changing the way people think about speaking, or the way you think about anything. Like you said, Malcolm X and whomever, the heroin addict, when they get themselves out of the environment where heroin is abundant, then they will change the mind will start to transform in accordance with the new environment.
Right. Absolutely true.
And that
we
is
also
so
have to
amazing.
look at what the investment is in viewing mental illness as a disease. And of course, one of the investments is that treatment providers make a heck of a lot of money.
Profit.
Oh, yeah.
Profit.
Oh, yeah.
The profit angle is huge.
Yeah.
There's an old saying, who benefits? Cui bono. It was a Latin saying, who benefits from calling it a disease? Well, it's not the patient, it's the treatment providers that benefit from it.
That's right.
And another thing that's important to pay attention to is that we cannot, and this is something that a lot of people don't understand, we cannot predict who is going to be dangerous to himself or to others with an accuracy beyond that expected by chance. There are many people who say, well, we've got to screen people to see if they are mentally ill so that we can give them the drugs that they usually don't want, but we think they need. And those are people that we think should not be able to get certain kinds of jobs or have certain privileges where they're responsible for others or get firearms, all of these different things. I'm not pushing the idea that people should be able to get firearms in any way they want to, but what I'm saying is that we cannot, and this is something that all psychiatrists know and psychologists know, but it's a big secret. We can't tell who is going to be a threat to others or to himself with an accuracy beyond that expected by chance. We can't take blood. We talked about this last time.
That's right.
We can't take blood. We can't take a picture of their brain and say this person is clearly dangerous to himself or to others, and so we should lock him up. We should deprive him of freedom. Well, that's a serious action where the person is deprived of freedom or liberty. It deprives them of what is called due process of law. You have to be accused of a crime in order to be deprived of freedom.
Right.
But today, psychiatrists have so much power, and psychologists do, where they make recommendations to judges, and a person finds himself in a mental institution because they declare that he is a threat to others. And the bottom line is that we can't tell them. We can't tell who is actually a threat to self and to others. But they put him in a mental institution and they pump him full of drugs. And still, actually what happens is that feeds anger towards the professionals, and I think has a lot to do with why professionals are attacked by people who are labeled as patients.
And you're so right, Dr. Schaler. I'd like to express a little bit about that on my behalf with being a patient. And I know when I became ill on my job, I was by these different doctors telling me to take this, take that, and you can become mentally ill, quote unquote, by all of these drugs and things you're taking. At one time, I was on 7 different drugs with varying side effects, one of them being Ambien, to the point I told my doctor I will no longer take these drugs because my body never being in a drug induced mode, because like I said, I never used street drugs and used very little of any other type of drugs, maybe Tylenol every now and then before I got sick from the job. And these doctors were drug pushers is what I would call them, because all they wanted me to do was take drugs. Fortunately, I had a doctor that believed in an integrative type of medication, not all the side effects, because these drugs have so many side effects. That Ambien had such a severe side effect on me, I could not sleep. I was getting 1 hour of sleep, and I knew it had to be the side effects of the drug. So I stopped taking this stuff, and I told my doctor I will not take this anymore. These different drugs, I was on about 7. I don't remember all of them that I was taking at the time. But I was so sick until the doctor said that taking one of them would outweigh whatever my illness was, would help me to get my breathing and everything back. But right. I know from me taking those drugs, I felt like I had become mentally ill. And sure. It's amazing what these drugs will do and the side effects. And I'm glad you brought out the profitability from it, because the pharmaceuticals make billions of dollars on us. And when you said something that really makes a lot of sense, there's a war on people, not a war on drugs, because Absolutely. The impact of the drugs really is how we in our society are walking around as medicine cabinets, many of us, unless we decide to be more proactive in our own life and decide I'm not going to take all these drugs because I see the side effects and the damage that it's doing to my body. And I see that also in the deterioration of my son, who's now 34, that was diagnosed with cancer, rare bone cancer at the age of 14. And over the years, all these drugs, they have made him worse than what he was prior to all of the cancer and the illness. So the cancer is gone, but if you see him now and what he's becoming, he's homeless because he's an adult. And we can talk a little bit about the criminal element of it, too. And I know you touched on that last time, how our society, we choose to lock so-called mentally ill people up as opposed to getting them help or leave them homeless on the streets.
Exactly.
We don't do that. We don't do that kind of stuff. You mentioned last week about Alcoholics Anonymous and how they go about their 12-step program with the notion of having the alcohol abuser tell themselves over and over and over how powerless they are against alcohol, a liquid.
Exactly.
You know, versus and how it can damage the liver and the brain. And you mentioned how if we go back, or when we go back to drinking more water to I guess enhance our thinking faculties versus drinking all of our sorrows away with alcohol.
And why is there not a war on alcohol? Answer that, Dr. Schaler.
Well, we went through that in the 1920s up until 1933, and that was called prohibition.
Prohibition, yes.
That's right.
You see how that worked out?
It didn't work out very well. Who benefited from that? Well, the criminals benefited from it. The government agents benefited from it. All kinds of people benefited from it.
That's right.
While there was a decrease in the incidence of cirrhosis of the liver, there was a huge increase in criminal activity.
Yep.
And you've got to look at, what's worse? Is it worse to have so many people in prison than people in jail? I mean, I was probably most moved when I was talking to a woman, a student of mine, and I asked her where her son was. He was 33 years old, and she said he's been in prison from age 23 to 33 because he sold half an ounce of marijuana.
There you go.
And when she told me that, I'll tell you, it brought tears to my eyes. I was so touched by her authenticity, and I knew that he had been robbed of one of the most important periods of his life.
Yes, and his freedom.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's just horrible. It was absolutely horrible. So I think that prohibition does much more harm than good. And I think we're discovering that more and more. But people love to impose their ideas about how people should live on others. They love to tell others how to live.
Right.
And, I think it's probably one of the biggest bases of social conflict that exists. This is what you should do. You know, I mean, even the anti, or even the lawyers that defend the tobacco industry have a saying that the anti-tobacco lobbyists love to adjust. They call them the shower adjusters. They love to tell people what the right temperature is for them to take a shower because they know what's best for others.
Right, right.
It's people love to tell others how to live, and I think that. I mean, nobody likes to be told what to do and how to live. I mean, we all know that there are certain laws, but the primary purpose of the laws is to protect us from one another, not to protect us from ourselves.
Well, every time a law is created, you're going to generate revenue.
Exactly.
And I have a question for you as well. My background, I have my board certification as a holistic psychology practitioner. I believe that, and I know that the human mind is a wonderful and probably the ultimate tool for manifestation. When you have a term called side effect, I'm going to go back to my mom talking about Ambien or any other drug that is presented to the public for one thing, and they tell you all the things that are going to happen to you within the 60-second advertisement. Is there a such thing as a side effect, or is it when you ingest the drug and you have I call them the initial effects versus side effects?
Right.
Is that accurate, or is there a such thing as side effects, or are these the true initial effects that are going to happen to you when you take something like an Ambien or a Prozac, which I believe one of the major ingredients is fluoride?
Right. Well, I don't think we even know all the different side effects that will come about as a result of consuming these drugs. The Ambien, for example, is what's called an hypnotic. And many people report being completely out of it when they're on that drug, so much so that they can't drive, they can't function. It's a terrible side effect, but you know, I don't know if it's a side effect in the sense that it's an effect.
That's right.
I think your point is that it's an effect that people have.
It's the initial effect.
Exactly.
When you have for example, when you take when you have a pill that dissolves in your digestive tract, and you have all the synthetic chemicals that are flowing through your bloodstream that the body cannot recognize as an energy source or any such faculty that it can use for the greater good of the human body. The body does anything and everything that it can to release this stuff, and this is why people get the jitters or they crash and burn. All of these different things that happen from the initial effects of your psychotropic drug, a Prozac, Ambien, Cymbalta, or Seroquel. All of these have an accumulative effect on the human brain, and what it does, it literally short circuits, if you will, your neurological circuitry, or how your neurons connect with each other via the way you think.
Well, I tell you what, it's something foreign that your body does not want, because I know how it made me feel. And I just told my doctor I'm not taking this anymore. And then they tried to give me something else. I think it was called Darvocet or something. And I said, no, I'm not taking this. And then he sent me to acupuncture and started giving me a more holistic type of approach. And I started getting better. Now here I am, 64. I'm not on any drugs. And I have doctors that want me to take drugs because I was given a lifetime medical due to the injury from my job, and doctors are putting it in my medical report. Well, no, she can't have acupuncture, she can't have physical therapy or chiropractic treatment because she won't take her medications. So they're dictating to me what my body will not accept. My body rejects all these things. So I'm saying, who are they to tell me what my body needs? I know what my body needs, and my body does not need all of these synthetic drugs that they are making that my body was not designed for. And I'm very adamant about that. And I told them I refuse to take these things. If you don't give me what my body needs, which it accepts, the acupuncture, the water therapy and all of this, because they diagnosed me with something I had never heard of, which is fibromyalgia. And those drugs had so many side effects. And I said, no. I mean, well, effects. I won't say you're right. They're not side effects. They're just effects. To the point some people are committing suicide with this type of these drugs and things, and it's all because these doctors and psychiatrists like that. I'm wondering sometimes, I'd like to ask them, well, are you taking these things? Are you giving these things to your family, and are you taking them?
Absolutely not.
That's a very important point. I've actually confronted some of my own orthopedic doctors where I've said to them, would you have this procedure on your back? Because I had major back surgery that ruined me. And they said, well, I don't have a back problem. And I said, no, if you had a back problem, would you take this procedure? Would you have this surgical procedure? And he paused and he said, no.
Right.
See?
Of course.
Well, then why are you telling me to go and have this done?
Exactly.
You know, this is exactly, you're not allowed to disagree with the expert. And this is what we need to do. We need to empower people and say, look, you have every right to tell the doctor that you don't like what he or she is prescribing.
That's right.
What they tend to do is say there's something wrong with you for disagreeing with them.
Yeah.
Well, that's okay.
It's a terrible situation, but people should not feel bad for disagreeing with their doctors.
Really, when it comes to your body. And I have another question to ask you, Dr. Schaler, on antidepressants versus psychotropic drugs. Is there a difference in those, and how is it a different classification or what?
Well, they're different drugs that do different things to neurotransmitters in your body. For example, one increases neurotransmitters like antidepressants like Prozac and Zoloft and others are called select serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And what they do is that they interfere with the process where your brain stops the neurotransmitter from flowing, and it allows it to flow in greater quantities than it normally would. On the other hand, you have a drug that's a dopamine inhibitor that's given to people who are diagnosed as schizophrenic, and it inhibits the amount of dopamine that flows in their brain. Now, as a result, I can't remember if we talked about this last time, but with those dopamine inhibitor drugs, one of the conditions that is prevalent is something called tardive dyskinesia.
Yeah,
and
you mentioned
people
that.
don't hear about that.
Yeah,
but
you mentioned that
the American
last week.
Psychiatric Association has issued warnings about this to psychiatrists for years. They've said, stop prescribing so many dopamine inhibiting drugs because you're causing a Parkinson's-like condition called tardive dyskinesia. Now, why are they prescribing these drugs? As a means of social control. They don't know what to do about people who are wandering out of the senior citizens or Alzheimer's unit. They can't control their behavior, so they keep giving them these drugs, which makes them just sit tight and behave themselves. They're treating adults as if they're children, and they don't know what else to do with them. But that's one of the differences, in the sense that the more powerful dopamine inhibiting drug is used as a stronger means of social control than Prozac. Although we talked about one of the problems with Prozac, and that was, I gave you a scenario, the audience a scenario where a woman, for example, but obviously it could be a man too, is unhappy in her marriage, in her situation, needs to make life changes. And instead of making those life changes, the doctor diagnoses her as not having enough serotonin, although there's no way that they can diagnose whether there's enough serotonin.
Exactly.
There. And then the person may or may not feel better when they give them Prozac. And then, but the bottom line is they feel better in a bad situation.
Right.
I mean, can you imagine the Revolutionary War if all the founding fathers and the people that fought the Revolutionary War were all on Prozac? I mean, the New Republic magazine had a cover years and years ago. What if all the founding fathers were on Prozac? And they painted this, they took this famous painting of the founding fathers, and they had them all smiling as if they were very happy.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, they were happy because they were on Prozac, but did they feel inclined to fight against the British? I mean, and you know, people in the late 60s argued, there were psychiatrists who argued that lithium and other drugs that were used for antidepressants should be put, and I know this is frightening, in the public drinking water because, and they specifically named leaders of civil rights movements as needing antidepressant drugs to quiet them down so that they would behave themselves.
Right. Social control, once again, controlling people and giving you a false sense of reality, which is really ridiculous. And
it's frightening to me.
It really is. It's frightening, very frightening, and it's troubling in living in a so-called democratic society. And we have these people who have decided that they're going to control the masses of people through drugs, and just because of profit and greed. And we're in such a crisis here in America when it comes to mental health. And so many people, as you said, Dr. Schaler, they don't take matters into their own hands and question their doctors because they think a doctor is like God to them, and whatever the doctor says, because I had an aunt who's passed away since, who would be in her hundreds now, and she would tell us we had to take drugs away from her because she was saying, oh, my doctor said I needed to do this. My doctor told me not to watch color TV. I only need to watch this black and white. So she kept a black and white TV for years because of what her doctor said. So we had to really bring her up to speed and help her as she got older. Now, it's something else you said, and I wanted to read something and have you to elaborate on it. Ken brought this up.
Before you ask your question, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to come right back, and she will have that question for you. So stay right there, and don't you go nowhere.
Okay.
This edition of Aim to Purpose, the radio show, is brought to you by L. Hicks Consulting Services. When you want the best in business coaching, life coaching, or perhaps your organization, business, or company is in need of a dynamic speaker for an upcoming workshop or seminar, contact Louise Hicks for L. Hicks Consulting Services at 1-562-310-1495. From anywhere around the world, that's 1-562-310-1495. For more information about Louise Hicks and her consulting services, visit her website at www.louisehicks.biz. Again, that's www.louisehicks.biz. Or call 1-562-310-1495. L. Hicks Consulting Services, where professionalism is top priority.
Hello, world. We are back. Once again, I'm Louise Hicks, your host, along with my co-host, Ken and Wesley Mason, and we're here today talking with Dr. Jeffrey Schaler about the myth of mental illness. And we're having a great discussion here, and we thank you, Dr. Schaler, for the invitation to come on and share some of this information with us, because it's so vital to what's going on in our society today, particularly with all the drugs that's being dispensed to some people that don't even need drugs, because I know if it was left up to the schools, even educators, are getting in on this this drug addiction problem, wanting to give it to our children. Because when my daughter was just 6 years old and I was having the crisis with my son, she was in a Christian school and they wanted me to give her Ritalin, and I told them I refused. I would take my daughter out of this school before I give her Ritalin or any other drug for that matter, because there's nothing wrong with her. She was acting out in school because she wasn't getting the attention she needed at home because of my time being divided. So even the children now, they're pushing it. But I wanted to ask you a question and read something about what Ken had touched on with water and alcohol. I know a lot of times people are drinking excessive amounts of alcohol, and they're being given over the counter, or they go and buy over the counter, and some have prescription drugs that they are taking, which I was reading somewhere, maybe you said this last week, about drinking some water and drinking it off and dispelling it from your body. But before you respond to that, let me read something. I know you were brought on, and I thank the Citizens Commission on Human Rights for getting us in touch with you and you coming on the show. But there's a newsletter that brought out something interesting that was posted in the Huffington Post, and it was shared in the CCHR newsletter. And it says that the psychiatrist Alan Francis, former chairman of the DSM, and that's that Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders that we talked about, task force, recently admitted the following in the Huffington Post: mental illness is terribly misleading because the mental disorders we diagnosed are no more than descriptions of what clinicians observe people do or say, not at all well-established diseases. And I know we talked about that last week about diseases. So it said mental disorders. Is there a difference between mental disorders and mental illness, or is it one and the same? And I know we established that mental illness, even psychiatrists are saying now, as he just said, is not a disease.
Right. They're one and the same. Mental illness became unpopular, and people consider it to be very stigmatizing. So they changed the phrase to mental disorders because they thought it would be more socially acceptable.
Take some of the sting off.
Exactly.
Okay.
Pretty much.
Remember, as I mentioned with Alan Francis, who I debated about 2 years ago on the Cato blog site.
Right, and I read that too.
Right, it was amazing. He admitted that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was, and I'll shorten the phrase, BS. He said it didn't mean anything. It was nonsense. It did not describe diseases. And, there are socially acceptable hallucinations and there are socially unacceptable hallucinations. As I mentioned last week, if you believe that there are pink elephants walking on the ceiling in your room, then that's considered a socially unacceptable hallucination or self-reported imagining. But if you believe that Jesus has entered your heart or that angels watch over you, those are considered socially acceptable hallucinations. And, I'm not pronouncing judgment on that. I'm just saying that the difference is basically meaningless because people, it's a political and subjective judgment that differentiates one from the other. But that's not the same thing when we talk about iron poor blood or low blood sugar, diabetes versus normal sugar levels in the body. These are real problems that can result in destruction of tissue in the body. But socially acceptable hallucinations are basically ones that we consider okay and fine as long as people vote them in and say that they're okay.
Right.
If all you have to do is go back to homosexuality and look at how homosexuality was included as a disorder, or originally a mental illness. It was considered one for political and subjective reasons, and now it's being removed again for political and subjective reasons. But the bottom line is, this isn't anything that we've discovered by looking under a microscope, looking at a microscope and looking at tissue, seeing abnormal cellular tissue.
You can't see homosexuality under a microscope.
Exactly. Perfect. You can't. And I think that's a very, very important difference here. But mental disorder and mental illness is a meaningless distinction.
Like it's a misnomer.
There's really nothing that makes it different one from the other. And what we usually consider as a mental disorder is a difficulty that a person has adjusting to his or her environment. Now, if you are white and you live in an environment, well, where white people are discriminated against, you may have a difficult time coping in that environment. Now, does that mean that you're having a mental illness?
Right.
If you're black and you're in a white society where people are racist, does that mean that you have a mental illness? Of course not.
Right.
If you are, one of the things I used to point out with my students, if you go into a bar, say you're in a city visiting and you're hungry and you go to a bar, and let's assume that you're straight, you're not homosexual. You want to get something to eat, and while you're getting something to eat at this restaurant, you notice that men are dancing with one another, or you're with somebody else and they're women dancing with one another. In other words, you've stumbled into a gay bar. All of a sudden, you feel different.
Right.
You feel abnormal.
That's
Does
right.
that mean that you're abnormal and uncomfortable because there's something wrong with you? No, it's because the environment in that situation
That's right.
is different.
Right.
But if it's one that is consistent with your orientation to life, then all of a sudden you're okay. But this has nothing to do with the disease at all. It's just a political, subjective judgment that people make to stigmatize others. And that's what psychiatry has been doing for a long, long time.
Yeah, they get together, either psychologists or psychiatrists and marketing firms, and they come together to form what we call the mastermind, and they present to us in a certain way how effective these drugs will be for you if you have certain diseases or whatnot. It's I don't fault them. More people have to be aware of what these drugs truly are. There's something that is not in harmony with how the human body functions. You mentioned diabetes and other illnesses, and I know my mom had a question or some questions about how nutrition or how diet can play a part in whether you develop an illness in the mind or mental illness, because some people do believe that nutrition or a certain way of dieting doesn't play a part in how your mind functions or how the brain functions.
Right.
Yeah, and I had that question because I wanted to discuss that. And it brought to mind because someone had put something on Facebook about mental illness had nothing to do with fitness and so forth. And this was a so-called fitness expert. And I begged to differ with her because I was sharing with her that I know people that are fitness experts and so forth, and their mindset is different when it comes to fitness, because I'm one to believe myself that the mind drives the body, not the body driving the mind. And I just wanted you to address that issue as to how the mind and your mental capacity, what it has to do with you being fit, and how your nutrition ties in with that as well, because of some of the fitness. Well, I don't know about any others, but this one particular fitness person felt that mental illness had nothing to do with physical fitness and so forth.
Well, who knows? Because everybody's needs are different. And this goes back to what I consider the fact that no two people are identical. People have different needs. and they have different ways of functioning in the world that result in making them feel differently. Some people need to go for a walk every day. They need to eat certain kinds of foods, and they find that it makes them feel better.
Right.
Others find that other foods make them feel better. That's why I'm very opposed to people imposing what they consider the right way to eat, the right way to sleep, the right way to exercise, and all that, because every person is different.
Yeah.
And what somebody who is really going to help another person has got to come to grips with is the fact that each person is different, and that person is going to help you find what it is that works best for you. It's like when people ask me, well, what kind of exercise is the best exercise? I said, well, what exercise do you enjoy doing the most? Let's go over some of that. Those are the things that we need to pay attention to. What kinds of foods do you feel best from eating? Those are the things that we need to adjust ourselves to, not just what somebody thinks or an expert says. Everybody's got to eat this way. Everybody's got to eat a ton of meat or no meat at all, or whatever. Each person has to explore and feel good about understanding their own individual needs. Those are the things that I think are so important, and not just bowing to an expert.
Right.
You know, if I may just go back, because I remember last week, Louise, you mentioned, well, where did some of these ideas about mental illness come from?
Right.
And we go back to the end of the 18th century. And that was, as you mentioned, Benjamin Rush, who was a physician. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And prior to this time, most people attributed mental illness or abnormal behavior to evil spirits or being bad in relation to God. Not listening to what your minister said. There were spiritual and religious explanations offered as to why a person was not functioning well. Now, one of the things that I want to point out that a lot of people don't understand, that Benjamin Rush, and I want your audience to just think about the implications of this. Benjamin Rush is a person whose silhouette is on all of the stationery, the doors, the books at the American Psychiatric Association, which I think is still on K Street in Washington, D.C. He was considered the hero, the father of American psychiatry. Now, one of the things that Benjamin Rush invented, and you mentioned this in terms of invention, Louise, and I think it was so important. There's a big difference between inventing a disease and discovering a disease. Benjamin Rush claimed when a man brought a black slave to him who had white spots on his arm, and the man who brought the slave's name was Henry Moss. And he said to Benjamin Rush, who was a well-known Philadelphia doctor, he said, what's going on with this person, Henry Moss? He's got white spots all over his body. Now, there's some famous people that you may recognize as having had the similar problem.
Of course.
Michael Jackson had it.
Yeah, vitiligo.
Right, exactly, vitiligo. Vitiligo is a genetic condition where your body loses melanin in the skin and it develops white spots. Black people and white people both get this condition. Okay,
that's right.
But what's interesting is what Benjamin Rush did. He looked at this and he said, Mr. Moss, you are experiencing what he called nigritude.
Yes.
Nigritude, he said, was the loss of black skin. And he said that the normal condition, the healthy condition of people was to have white skin, and being black was a sick condition of the skin. And he said, you were experiencing the spontaneous cure of your blackness.
Oh.
Now, even though he said, and this is the nonsense that he pushed out, even though he said, I love even the name Africa. I'm not going to say anything bad about black people or slaves who came from Africa. Based on my discovery, you must not intermarry with white people. And the reason for this, he said, is because you would be spreading this form of leprosy called nigritude. My point is this. First of all, there was nothing scientific about it.
Right.
Second of all, he used a pseudo medical invention to propose a form of racist policy. And that was that blacks and whites should not intermarry. He also pronounced...
Make it quick, Wiz. We're almost out of time.
I'm sorry. He also pronounced drunkenness to be a disease, too. He was the first person that did that. I'm sorry.
Wow.
I just wanted to make sure that if people are interested in following up on this, here's an example of an invention that masqueraded as science that was used for racist purposes.
Absolutely. Nigritude.
That's right. One of the creations, racism is a created condition versus it being some illness that just popped out of nowhereville.
Exactly.
And that's what's been going on over the years, and we wonder why we have so much of a problem here in the United States. But on that note, Dr. Schaler, we are pretty much out of time, so can you give us a last minute in 60 seconds, kind of wrap it up? And we want to have you back for sure.
Yes.
Oh, love to. I really enjoyed being with you. What I would like to encourage people to do is to trust themselves and challenge the experts. Do listen to others who disagree with their experts and challenge the medical authorities. When you have doubts, don't hold it back.
Right.
Absolutely.
One of the worst things that happened in history was the Tuskegee experiment, which was...
gosh. We can go a whole nother half hour about that one.
We will have you back, and we'll talk about that. Give us your website, and then we're going to have to...
Okay. Well, my website is www.schaler, SCHALER.com. .net. And I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to talk about this more. You have a wonderful show. Thanks so much for having me on.
And thank you. And we will have you back sometime before the year is over for sure, because we have a lot of questions we want you to answer, a lot more we could have talked about. And on that note, we thank you, Dr. Schaler, for joining us today. And we'd like to thank the Citizens Commission on Human Rights for bringing you to us. And also, I'd like to share with you to join us on Twitter at Aim to Purpose, Facebook, Louise Hicks 51, YouTube. And also go on our website, YouTube, Aim to Purpose Radio, our website, louisehicks.biz, and you can click on the blog and everything else. And with that being said, we are going to see you all next week. And Ken, you have something you need to say?
Your power lies within you. Let it loose. Until next week.
Right on.